Most species panic when gravity increases, Commander Lyra Vane once told her officers. Humans just remember harder lives. The first warning chime rolled through Orpheus Station at 3:17 a.m. Shipboard time. A low metallic pulse. Come at first. Then another. Deeper this time. The kind of sound people felt in their ribs before they understood it with their minds. Across the observation deck, silver utensils slid half an inch across polished tables. A glass tipped over somewhere behind the bar. The station's artificial horizon lights flickered from soft blue to amber. Then red. Ethan Cole didn't look up right away. He sat alone near the far window, one broad hand wrapped loosely around a ceramic coffee mug, while the stars drifted silently beyond the reinforced glass. A pale blue gas giant turned slowly beneath the station like an enormous winter eye staring back at the universe. The coffee rippled once. Barely noticeable. Ethan took another sip anyway. Around him, conversation stopped. Alien traders glanced nervously toward the ceiling as the gravity warning symbols illuminated across the deck in sharp crimson lines. A pair of Varelian cargo inspectors immediately braced themselves against a nearby rail, their thin silver bodies visibly tightening under the sudden pressure shift. One of the station attendants stumbled hard enough to drop an entire tray of steaming cups onto the floor. Ceramic shattered. Hot liquid spread across the polished metal deck in dark waves. Gravity fluctuation detected, the station voice announced calmly. Compensators recalibrating. Ethan finally exhaled through his nose and lowered the mug. That doesn't sound good, he muttered quietly. He was 43 years old, white, broad-shouldered, and built less like a soldier than a man who had spent decades lifting heavy equipment in dangerous places where machines failed more often than people admitted. His brown jacket looked old enough to remember bad winters. A faded patch from the Titan Belt Rescue Fleet still clung to one sleeve by loose threads. The overhead lights dimmed again. Another pulse hit. Harder this time. Ethan felt it immediately in his knees. Around the observation deck, chairs groaned against the floor. Several alien passengers let out startled breaths as the pressure intensified. One woman near the elevator dropped fully to one knee, gripping the railing with both hands. Somewhere deeper in the station, metal creaked like an old ship caught in rough seas. Ethan simply adjusted his posture and steadied the coffee with 2 fingers. Not a drop spilled over the rim. Through the glass partition overlooking the control mezzanine above, Commander Lyra Vane watched him carefully. Her pale silver skin reflected the red emergency lighting in soft streaks across her sharp cheekbones. Tall and composed in her dark command uniform, she stood perfectly still while officers rushed around her station. Gravity just doubled in Sector 3, one technician warned. Compensators are unstable. Lyra barely acknowledged him. Her attention remained fixed on the human sitting alone below. She had reviewed humanity's files for nearly 3 years. Planetary wars. Extreme environments. Industrial survival statistics that bordered on absurd. But reports were easy to dismiss from behind a desk. She trusted observation more than rumors. And right now, under nearly twice standard station gravity, the human wasn't even gripping the table. Another warning pulse rolled through the station. Stronger. The polished steel support beams overhead vibrated with a low mechanical hum. Several beings near the entrance collapsed into nearby seats under the mounting pressure. Ethan looked down into his coffee for a long moment, almost thoughtful. Then he reached into his jacket pocket with his free hand. Slowly, carefully, his fingers closed around something small hidden inside the fabric. A ring. Old silver. Worn smooth with time. His wedding band. The gravity pressed harder against his shoulders now, heavy enough that even breathing became noticeable. But Ethan had felt heavier things before. Hospital waiting rooms. Silent houses after funerals. Empty passenger seats on long cargo flights home. The station lights flashed red again. And somehow, impossibly, the coffee still never spilled. The gravity climbed again with a sound like distant thunder buried deep inside the station walls. Ethan felt it first in the table legs. A low vibration traveled through the metal frame and into his wrist as the ceramic mug trembled softly beneath his fingers. Around the observation deck, emergency shutters slid halfway down over the panoramic windows with slow hydraulic groans. Someone near the entrance whispered a prayer in a language Ethan did not recognize. Another passenger began breathing too fast. The overhead pressure monitors flashed from red to white. White meant the station was no longer compensating evenly. It meant the machine itself was struggling. Ethan leaned back carefully in his chair and looked toward the ceiling vents where fine dust had started drifting downward in lazy gray ribbons. "That is not good," he said quietly to himself. Above him, Commander Lyra Vane finally moved away from the control glass. Her boots struck the metal stairs with precise measured steps while the rest of the command deck descended into controlled panic around her. Officers called out fluctuating numbers. System alerts stacked across glowing displays. One of the younger technicians nearly collapsed while trying to stabilize himself against the railing. The gravity in the station had reached nearly 4 times standard Earth conditions. Most species aboard Orpheus Station had never experienced anything close to that level of pressure. Lyra descended onto the observation deck floor with unnatural calm. Her pale silver hair remained perfectly arranged despite the increasing force pressing against everyone in the room. She stopped several feet from Ethan's table and studied him openly now. He looked older up close. Fine lines around the eyes. Exhaustion buried deep in the corners of his face. The kind that sleep never really fixed. His coffee steamed gently between them. "You should be struggling," Lyra said at last. Ethan glanced up slowly. "I am struggling." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Your heart rate has barely increased. That does not mean much." Another pulse rolled through the station. Strong enough this time that several overhead lights burst with sharp metallic pops. A serving cart broke loose near the far wall and slammed into a support beam before collapsing sideways. One alien passenger cried out as security officers rushed to help stabilize the crowd. Ethan finally set his coffee down fully. Even that small movement looked deliberate under the crushing pressure. Lyra noticed the faint tremor in his right hand immediately. "You are injured." Ethan flexed his fingers once before answering. "Old rescue accident. Yet you remain calm." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, then disappeared almost instantly. Calm is cheaper than panic. Lyra stared at him for several long seconds. Her species valued physical control above almost everything else. Strength. Precision. Discipline. But what unsettled her now was not the human's endurance. It was the absence of fear in his eyes, as if pressure itself no longer surprised him. Behind them, another officer collapsed to both knees under the increasing load. Emergency responders hurried forward with portable support braces. Ethan watched silently for a moment before speaking again. "How high are you pushing it?" Lyra hesitated. 4.7 times standard. Ethan gave a quiet whistle under his breath. Somebody upstairs either made a bad mistake. He looked toward the flickering ceiling lights. Or they are testing something they should not be testing. For the first time since arriving on the station, Lyra's composure shifted. Barely. But enough. Ethan noticed. "You knew about this. I authorized a controlled gravity stress evaluation," she admitted carefully. Human resilience reports have long been disputed. Ethan let out a tired breath through his nose. So this was a science experiment. A precaution. Feels heavy enough to be both. Another deep vibration rolled beneath their feet. This time the floor itself dipped almost half an inch before stabilizing again. Several people screamed softly across the deck as warning sirens finally shifted from steady pulses into full emergency alarms. Lyra turned toward the ceiling displays, her expression hardening. The compensators are no longer responding. Ethan reached for his coffee again. The mug shook once beneath his hand. Still not a single drop spilled over the edge. Then this station is about to have a very bad day. The next impact hit like the station had driven straight into invisible concrete. Every light on the observation deck died for half a second before emergency strips along the floor ignited in deep crimson lines. The artificial gravity lurched violently, then settled heavier than before. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs in a slow, controlled breath as pressure pushed down across his shoulders and spine with crushing persistence. Somewhere overhead, metal screamed. Not loudly. Just enough to make everyone in the room understand something expensive was bending the wrong way. Several civilians near the observation windows could no longer stand at all. Security personnel moved carefully through the deck, helping people toward reinforced support benches built for emergency compression events. A child cried somewhere behind Ethan. Small. Frightened. The sound lingered strangely beneath the alarms. Commander Lyra Vane pressed 2 fingers against the communicator embedded near her collar. "Control deck, report." Static answered first. Then a strained voice. "Primary compensator ring has gone offline. Gravity fluctuations are spreading into civilian sectors. Engineering teams cannot reach the lower stabilizers." Another violent vibration shook the station hard enough to crack a long fracture across one of the decorative wall panels. Ethan looked toward it automatically. Years of rescue work had trained his eyes to notice stress points before failure spread. The crack curved downward in branching silver lines. Not cosmetic. Structural pressure. "How old is this station?" he asked quietly. Lyra glanced toward him. 43 standard cycles. Ethan nodded once. "Then your support spine was never designed for this kind of sustained load. You can tell that from a wall. Walls tell you everything if you survive enough collapses." Another pulse rolled beneath their feet. This one felt wrong immediately. Uneven. Instead of uniform pressure, the gravity shifted sideways for a fraction of a second before correcting itself. Several unsecured tables slid violently across the floor. One struck a support pillar with a hollow metallic crash. Ethan's coffee mug shifted nearly 2 inches across the table surface. He caught it calmly before it tipped. Lyra stared at the mug in disbelief, now more than curiosity. "How are you still holding that?" Ethan looked at the cup for a moment as steam curled faintly upward into the red emergency light. "My wife used to yell at me for carrying coffee through turbulence." The answer surprised her. Not because of the words themselves. Because of the softness behind them. Ethan rarely sounded emotional. Even now his voice remained steady and low, but grief lived quietly beneath it like an old scar beneath fabric. Lyra noticed his thumb brushing unconsciously against the silver ring in his pocket again. "She is gone," Lyra said carefully. Ethan nodded once. 3 years. Silence settled between them for a few seconds despite the alarms. Strange how grief could quiet even a collapsing station. Then the floor buckled. A deep, booming shockwave rolled upward from somewhere below the civilian decks. The observation windows darkened instantly as emergency blast shutters slammed into place over the glass with deafening force. People screamed. The station tilted nearly 5 degrees to the left before stabilizers fought desperately to compensate. Ethan rose from his chair for the first time. Slowly. Deliberately. The sheer force pressing down on the deck made movement look unnatural now, like every motion had to be negotiated with gravity itself. Around them, several officers could barely remain upright. Ethan stood anyway. His knees locked once beneath the weight before steadying. He picked up the coffee mug again, almost absent-mindedly. "That was not a compensator failure," he said. Lyra's expression hardened immediately. "What was it?" Ethan listened carefully. Beneath the alarms. Beneath the groaning steel. Deep below them, hidden somewhere inside the station's enormous mechanical skeleton, came a sound he knew too well. Rhythmic. Grinding. Rotational stress losing synchronization. His eyes lifted slowly toward the ceiling. "Your core stabilizer is tearing itself apart." For the first time since the emergency began, Commander Lyra Vane looked genuinely afraid. The station lights dimmed low enough that the entire observation deck seemed submerged underwater. Red emergency strips along the floor cast long shadows beneath tables and frightened passengers, while the metal walls groaned under the increasing strain. Ethan had heard structures die before. Ships. Mining rigs. Docking platforms hanging over frozen moons. Machines always sounded different right before failure. Less like engines. More like exhaustion. Commander Lyra Vane steadied herself against the nearest support rail as another tremor rolled upward through Orpheus Station. Somewhere in the distance, a deep mechanical thud echoed through the lower sectors. Slow. Heavy. Repeating every few seconds now. "That is the stabilizer ring slipping alignment," Ethan said quietly. "Once it starts skipping rotation teeth, the gravity field stops distributing evenly." Lyra looked at him sharply. "Can it be repaired?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He watched the ceiling instead. Listening. Feeling the vibrations through the deck beneath his boots. Another pulse hit. Hard enough this time that overhead ventilation panels burst open across the room, scattering dust and fragments of insulation into the heavy air. Several civilians cried out in alarm. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Counting. Timing. Then he looked back at her. Maybe. It was not a comforting answer. Lyra touched her communicator again. Engineering teams are trapped between civilian corridors. Lift systems are offline. We cannot reach the lower core sectors safely. Ethan nodded once. Then somebody is going to have to walk there. Her expression hardened instantly. Under these conditions, most of my crew will collapse before reaching the stabilizer chamber. Yeah. Ethan lifted the coffee mug again and took a small sip. Even now, the drink trembled softly against the ceramic walls. That is kind of the problem. Lyra stared at him in open disbelief. You are considering this. I am considering whether your station spine still has enough integrity to survive another 10 minutes. Another deep groan rolled through the deck beneath them. This one louder than before. Across the observation room, one of the support beams bent with a long metallic creak that made everyone freeze. Ethan watched the beam carefully. 9 minutes, he corrected softly. Lyra followed his eyes toward the beam. Her species had mastered gravity technology centuries ago. They trusted it completely. Built cities around it. Entire cultures shaped by precision control over physical force. The idea of gravity itself becoming unstable felt almost impossible to her people. Humans, Ethan suspected, trusted nothing for very long. You already knew this station was overloaded, Ethan said suddenly. Lyra remained silent. That is why you were testing human tolerance levels. Her jaw tightened slightly. Trade routes have become dangerous near the outer colonies. We needed to understand whether humans could survive environments that most species cannot. Ethan gave a faint, tired laugh under his breath. Could have just asked. Your military records are heavily classified. That usually means somebody important made a mistake. For the first time since meeting him, Lyra almost smiled. It vanished quickly beneath another station-wide alarm pulse. The floor shifted violently beneath them. This time gravity lurched sideways hard enough that passengers slid several feet across the deck before security officers caught them. Ethan planted one hand firmly against the table and remained standing through the shift. His coffee tilted nearly to the rim. One dark drop finally spilled over the edge onto his knuckle. He looked at it for a moment in complete silence, then wiped it away with his thumb. Well, he muttered softly. There goes the perfect record. Lyra blinked once in confusion before realizing he was joking. Somehow that unsettled her even more. Human, she said carefully, why are you still calm? Ethan looked toward the sealed blast shutters covering the observation windows where the distant stars remained hidden behind layers of reinforced steel. His voice lowered when he answered. Because panic does not help trap people breathe easier. Another heavy tremor rolled upward from the lower sectors. Then came a new sound. Faint at first. Small. But unmistakable. Children crying over the emergency intercom. The crying continued through the emergency speakers in broken, uneven bursts. Young voices. Frightened. Somewhere below the civilian decks where the gravity fluctuations had struck hardest. Ethan's expression changed the moment he heard them. Not dramatically. Just enough for Lyra to notice the shift behind his tired eyes. He set the coffee mug down carefully on the table beside him and rolled his shoulders once beneath the crushing pressure. The old injury in his right arm clearly bothered him now. She could see it in the stiffness of his movement. What section are those transmissions coming from? He asked. Lyra checked the flickering display attached to her wrist console. Family Transit Corridor 7. Her voice tightened slightly. There is a school transport dock connected to that sector. Ethan nodded slowly, as if confirming something unpleasant. How many children? Approximately 30. Another tremor rolled beneath their feet hard enough to shake dust loose from the overhead support seams. Across the observation deck, passengers huddled low against reinforced walls while emergency crews distributed portable gravity braces to anyone unable to stand. Several beings were crying quietly now. Others simply stared downward in exhausted silence. The pressure inside the station had become constant, heavy enough that even breathing sounded laborious. Ethan looked toward the nearest corridor leading deeper into the station interior. How far to the lower stabilizer levels? Nearly half a mile beneath this deck. And the children? Lyra hesitated. On the way, Ethan gave a single tired nod. Then that settles it. She stepped in front of him immediately. You cannot seriously intend to go down there. Somebody has to. You are not station personnel. Gravity does not care about job titles. Another deep metallic groan rolled through the walls around them. This time several overhead lights failed permanently, leaving entire sections of the observation deck buried in darkness except for the pulsing red emergency glow. Ethan looked around slowly at the frightened civilians pressed together beneath the heavy air. Then back toward Lyra. You know what the difference is between humans and most species? Her silver eyes narrowed slightly. What? Ethan slipped the old wedding ring back into his jacket pocket. Most people think strength means lifting heavy things. He looked toward the trembling corridor lights leading downward into the station. Humans learn it usually means carrying them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The alarms continued. The station groaned around them. Somewhere below, another child cried out through the emergency channel before the transmission dissolved into static. Lyra watched Ethan reach for his jacket collar and tighten it against his neck with slow, deliberate movements. He looked less like a hero than a man preparing to fix another broken machine before retirement finally caught him. Somehow that frightened her more than bravado would have. The lower sectors are unstable, she warned quietly. Gravity spikes could exceed survivable levels at any moment. Ethan reached for the coffee mug one last time. The ceramic surface was warm against his hand despite the freezing tension inside the room. He drank the final sip slowly, then placed the empty mug upside down on the table. I worked salvage after the Europa dock collapse, he said. Pulled families out of twisted corridors for 16 straight hours. His voice remained calm. Matter of fact. After a while you stop asking whether something is survivable. Lyra studied him carefully. Then what do you ask? Ethan looked toward the corridor again. Whether somebody is still waiting. The station shuddered violently. A loud crack echoed somewhere below them, followed by a sudden drop in gravity that made half the room stagger sideways before the crushing force slammed back harder than before. Several support beams groaned in protest. Emergency sirens shifted pitch into a higher, sharper warning tone. Structural failure approaching. Lyra grabbed the nearest rail to steady herself. Ethan barely moved. Commander, one of the security officers shouted across the room. We are losing containment on the lower rotational spine. Lyra looked at Ethan. Really looked at him this time. The exhausted eyes. The worn jacket. The old grief carried quietly inside him like permanent weight. Humans terrified her species because they adapted too easily to impossible conditions. But standing there beneath enough pressure to crush most beings to the floor, Ethan Cole did not look dangerous. He looked familiar. like someone who had already survived too much to abandon strangers now. The corridor beyond the observation deck felt heavier with every step. Emergency lights flickered weakly behind layers of drifting dust, while deep mechanical vibrations rolled continuously through the walls like distant thunder trapped inside steel. Ethan moved beside Commander Lyra Vane in steady, measured strides, one hand brushing occasionally against the rail mounted along the corridor wall whenever the gravity spikes intensified. The pressure had climbed high enough now that even lifting his boots required visible effort. Behind them, station personnel continued evacuating civilians toward reinforced upper sectors. Ahead waited the lower transit spine, and somewhere beyond it, 30 frightened children trapped between a collapsing gravity network and a failing station core. Ethan had walked through disaster zones before. The sounds never changed. The strained metal. The alarms repeating too long. The silence between people when fear became too large for conversation. A service hatch slammed shut somewhere down the corridor with a loud metallic bang that echoed through the heavy air. Lyra glanced toward the sound automatically. Ethan kept moving forward. "You really think you can stabilize the core?" she asked quietly. No, the honesty caught her off guard. Ethan adjusted his breathing before continuing. "I think maybe I can keep it from killing everybody long enough to evacuate the station." Another gravity fluctuation rolled sideways through the corridor. The floor tilted sharply beneath them before correcting itself with a violent jolt. Lyra grabbed the nearest support beam instantly. Ethan simply widened his stance and absorbed the shift through tired knees that had probably endured worse decades ago. They passed a collapsed security checkpoint where emergency doors had buckled partially inward beneath the pressure. Two station officers struggled nearby to free trapped civilians from beneath a twisted support panel. Ethan slowed immediately. "How many?" One officer looked up, breathing hard beneath the crushing gravity. "3 adults. 1 child." Ethan handed his jacket to Lyra without a word and stepped toward the damaged beam. "What are you doing?" she asked sharply. "Helping. The stabilizer core will still be broken in 30 seconds. Ethan crouched beside the collapsed support frame with visible strain. The pressure inside the corridor was approaching levels unsafe even for heavily conditioned humans now. Sweat lined his forehead. His injured arm trembled once as he gripped the edge of the twisted beam. Then slowly, steadily, he lifted. Metal groaned. The trapped civilians crawled free one by one beneath the raised support, while nearby officers stared in stunned silence. Ethan did not yell, did not strain dramatically. He simply endured. The final civilian emerged clutching a small child wrapped tightly against their chest. Ethan lowered the beam carefully back into place afterward and rested one hand briefly against the wall while catching his breath. Lyra stepped closer instinctively. "You are injured. Everybody is injured after 40. Despite everything." The corner of her mouth twitched faintly upward. Ethan noticed and gave a tired half-smile in return before picking up the jacket again. The moment passed quickly beneath another station-wide tremor. Somewhere below them came the sharp, grinding roar of enormous machinery tearing itself apart. The corridor lights dimmed dangerously low. Then emergency backup systems engaged with a deep electric hum beneath the floor. Lyra checked her wrist console. Her expression changed immediately. Gravity in the lower transit sectors just reached 6.2 times standard. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. That is going to feel unpleasant. Human medical records indicate loss of consciousness begins shortly after that threshold. Ethan pulled his jacket back over his shoulders. Good thing I have always been stubborn. They continued deeper into the station together, while the air itself seemed to grow heavier around them. Every few feet, another section of the corridor showed signs of stress fractures spreading along the walls. Tiny lines at first, then larger ones. Structural fatigue moving like cracks through old ice. Ahead, through layers of dim emergency haze, the lower transit junction finally became visible. Dozens of civilians crowded near sealed blast doors, while gravity pressure forced many to the floor entirely. At the center of the corridor stood a group of frightened alien children no older than elementary school age, clinging tightly to one another beneath the screaming alarms. One small boy looked up as Ethan and Lyra approached through the red emergency light. "Are we going to die here?" he asked softly. Ethan stopped in front of him for a moment. The station groaned violently around them. Somewhere far below, the stabilizer core gave another deep mechanical shudder. Ethan looked down at the terrified child and answered with quiet certainty. "Not today." The lower transit junction shook continuously now. Not from isolated impacts anymore, but from the deep, unstable rhythm of an entire station losing its balance against gravity itself. Emergency lights flashed through drifting clouds of dust while frightened civilians crowded against sealed evacuation doors waiting for systems that no longer responded. Ethan moved carefully through the corridor toward the children, each step heavy beneath more than 6 times standard gravity. Even breathing required concentration now. The air felt thick, pressurized, like trying to inhale beneath deep water. One little girl with pale lavender skin clutched tightly to his sleeve the moment he knelt beside them. Her eyes were wide with terror. "The floor keeps moving," she whispered. Ethan looked down at her gently. "Yeah," he said softly. "But floors usually stop doing that eventually." The answer earned the smallest uncertain nod. Nearby, Commander Lyra Vane was issuing rapid orders through her communicator while emergency crews struggled to stabilize the transit corridor. "Manual override teams are not responding," an officer reported through static. "The lower stabilizer chamber is completely isolated." Another tremor struck hard enough that several overhead panels burst apart in showers of sparks. The gravity surged violently for half a second. Ethan immediately pulled 2 children closer before the sudden force shift could throw them sideways across the deck. Several civilians cried out as the corridor lights flickered dangerously low again. Then came a new sound. A slow, deep, grinding roar from somewhere directly beneath them. Ethan froze instantly. He recognized it at once. Rotational failure. The stabilizer core was no longer slipping. It was breaking. "Everybody away from the center floor panels," he shouted. The authority in his voice cut cleanly through the panic. Civilians moved instinctively toward the corridor walls, while security officers helped those too weak to stand. Ethan looked toward Lyra. "How close are we to the primary stabilizer shaft?" Her face paled slightly beneath the red emergency lighting. "Directly below this junction." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Calculating. Listening to the vibrations beneath his boots. Then when that core ruptures, this corridor becomes the collapse point. A loud metallic crack exploded beneath the floor before anyone could answer. The entire junction lurched downward several inches with a horrifying groan of twisting steel. Children screamed. Emergency lights died completely for 2 full seconds. In the darkness, Ethan felt dozens of terrified hands grab onto his jacket and arms. Then backup power returned in weak, pulsing red waves. The center of the corridor floor had split open. Not fully. Just enough to reveal darkness beneath the station and the faint rotating glow of damaged machinery hundreds of feet below. Heat rolled upward through the widening fracture, carrying the sharp metallic smell of overheated systems. Lyra stared downward in shock. The stabilizer ring, Ethan nodded grimly. It is coming apart. Another violent gravity spike slammed through the station. Several civilians collapsed entirely under the crushing pressure. Ethan himself dropped briefly to one knee before forcing himself upright again with visible strain. Sweat ran down the side of his face now. His injured arm shook continuously beneath the weight pressing against every bone in his body. Still, his attention remained on the civilians first. Always the civilians. "Commander," one of the officers called out desperately, "the evacuation lifts are dead. We cannot move these people." Ethan looked toward the widening fracture in the floor. Then toward the sealed maintenance corridor across the junction. Old emergency access route. Reinforced walls. Shortest path to the stabilizer core. He already knew what had to happen before he spoke. There is still one way to stop this. Lyra turned sharply toward him. No, Ethan almost smiled. I did not even explain the plan yet. I know what you are about to say. Another deep mechanical boom rolled upward through the station as the gravity fluctuated wildly again. Somewhere far above them, metal support beams screamed beneath impossible strain. The entire station was running out of time now. Ethan looked back toward the frightened children huddled together near the corridor wall. One small boy stared up at him with trembling eyes. "You promised," the child whispered. Ethan held the boy's gaze for a long moment. Then he slowly reached into his jacket pocket and wrapped his fingers around the old silver wedding ring hidden inside. The metal felt warm despite the freezing pressure surrounding them. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I did." The maintenance corridor leading toward the stabilizer shaft was barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. Reinforced bulkheads lined the walls in thick layers of dark alloy scarred by years of stress fractures and emergency repairs. Every few seconds the floor trembled beneath Ethan's boots as if the entire station were breathing unevenly around them. Gravity fluctuated violently now. One moment crushing. The next almost drifting sideways before slamming back harder than before. Ethan moved through it with grim, steady focus, while Commander Lyra Vane stayed close behind him, carrying a portable stabilization kit against her chest. Neither of them spoke for nearly a minute. The corridor itself sounded too loud already. Warning sirens. Groaning steel. The deep rotational roar of a dying gravity core somewhere below. Ethan reached the first sealed maintenance hatch and planted both hands against the manual release wheel. Under normal conditions, the hatch operated hydraulically. Under 7 times standard gravity, nothing operated normally anymore. Muscles tightened visibly beneath his sleeves as he forced the wheel downward inch by inch. Metal shrieked against metal. Lyra stepped forward immediately to help him. Together they forced the hatch open just wide enough to slip through. Heat hit them instantly on the other side. Dry mechanical heat carrying the sharp electrical smell of overloaded systems. The stabilizer access shaft stretched downward through the center of the station like the inside of some enormous industrial furnace. Rotating gravity rings hundreds of feet below flashed unevenly with bursts of unstable blue light, while thick support cables trembled under impossible stress. Ethan looked downward in silence for several long seconds. "Well," he muttered quietly. "That is considerably worse than I hoped." Another violent surge rolled upward through the shaft. Both of them grabbed the rail instantly as gravity spiked hard enough to make the entire structure groan. Ethan's injured arm nearly buckled beneath the pressure before stabilizing again. Lyra noticed immediately. "You are reaching your limit." Ethan gave a faint, tired smile. "Been reaching it since about 1998. The answer almost sounded casual. But his breathing had grown noticeably heavier now. Sweat soaked through the collar of his shirt despite the cold air circulating through the shaft. Even his movements had slowed beneath the crushing force pressing constantly against every joint and muscle in his body. Still, he kept descending. Step by heavy step. They reached the primary stabilizer platform nearly 10 minutes later. The sight stopped Lyra cold. The central gravity ring had partially torn free from its rotational housing. Massive magnetic anchors sparked violently, while the spinning core wobbled off alignment with every rotation. One more catastrophic shift, and the entire station spine would collapse inward. Ethan stared at the damaged machinery with exhausted understanding. Manual stabilizer controls. Lyra pointed toward a secondary console platform extending over the rotating core assembly. Half the walkway had already bent downward under structural strain. Ethan measured the distance silently. 30 feet, maybe. Over open machinery spinning beneath gravity levels strong enough to pulverize most species instantly if they slipped. "If somebody manually resets the rotational locks," Lyra said carefully, "the station might stabilize long enough for evacuation." Ethan nodded once. "Might." Another violent shudder ripped through the platform. Sparks burst overhead. One of the magnetic supports below failed with a deep explosive crack that echoed through the shaft like thunder. The entire station tilted slightly sideways. Ethan steadied himself against the rail, breathing hard now. "And after the reset?" Lyra hesitated. "The platform will likely collapse." Silence filled the shaft except for the roar of unstable machinery. Ethan looked down toward the spinning gravity core below them, then reached slowly into his pocket again. The silver wedding ring rested quietly against his palm beneath the emergency lights. "My wife hated stations like this," he said softly. Lyra looked at him carefully. "Why?" She said, "Places built around gravity always forget how fragile people are." His thumb brushed once across the worn surface of the ring. "Turns out she was smarter than me." Before Lyra could answer, Ethan placed the ring gently into her hand. Her silver eyes widened immediately. "Ethan, if I do not make it back up here," he said quietly, "give that to somebody who still has time left." Another gravity surge rolled through the shaft hard enough to bend the damaged platform another few inches downward toward the spinning core below. Ethan looked toward the unstable walkway stretching into the red emergency light. Then he started walking. The platform shook beneath Ethan's boots with every uneven rotation of the damaged gravity core below. Heat rolled upward through the shaft in violent waves while unstable blue light flashed across the walls like distant lightning trapped inside machinery. The narrow maintenance walkway groaned under his weight as he crossed slowly toward the manual stabilizer console at the far end. Behind him, Commander Lyra Vane watched in complete silence with the silver wedding ring clenched tightly in her hand. Around them, the station sounded alive in the worst possible way. Metal twisting. Bolts snapping loose. Emergency sirens rising and falling beneath the roar of rotational failure. Ethan kept moving anyway. One careful step at a time. Gravity surged again. Hard enough that the entire walkway dipped several inches downward toward the spinning core. Ethan caught himself against the rail with his injured arm and froze briefly while pain crossed his face like a shadow. His breathing had become rough now. Slow. Controlled. The kind of breathing people used when they knew panic wasted oxygen. Ethan, Lyra called out over the noise. The platform is collapsing. He glanced back only once. Yeah, he answered calmly. I noticed. Another magnetic anchor below them failed with a thunderous crack. The gravity core shifted violently off-center, and the entire shaft tilted sideways for 2 terrifying seconds before stabilizers compensated partially. Warning lights across the manual console flashed bright white now. Final containment stage. Ethan finally reached the end of the platform and wrapped both hands around the emergency override wheel mounted beside the stabilizer locks. The wheel barely moved at first. 7 times standard gravity pressed against every mechanism in the station now. Against every bone in his body, too. Ethan lowered his head slightly and pushed harder. Metal screamed. The override wheel shifted 1 inch. Then another. Behind him, Lyra felt something unfamiliar tightening painfully in her chest. Fear, yes. But not for herself. Her species had studied humans for years trying to understand their endurance, their aggression, their impossible survival statistics. None of the reports had explained this. The quietness of it. The way humans carried suffering without announcing it to the universe. Ethan forced the wheel downward another few inches. Sweat dripped from his face onto the metal platform below. Every muscle in his arms trembled violently beneath the pressure. Then suddenly the gravity surged again. 8 times standard. The entire station groaned like a ship sinking beneath an ocean. Ethan dropped hard to one knee against the platform. The override wheel nearly slipped from his grasp. Lyra stepped forward instinctively before the damaged walkway beneath her feet buckled sharply downward. She froze immediately. One wrong shift now, and the entire platform could shear apart completely. Ethan remained motionless for several seconds beneath the crushing weight. Breathing. Enduring. Then slowly, painfully, he stood again. Why? Lyra shouted over the roar of the failing core. Why would you do this for strangers? Ethan's hand tightened around the wheel. The answer came softer than the alarms. Because somebody once stayed for me. He pushed again with everything left in him. The override wheel locked downward with a deafening metallic slam. For one horrible second nothing happened. Then the stabilizer rings below began slowing unevenly into alignment. One by one the warning lights across the shaft shifted from white back to red. Gravity fluctuations stabilized. Not perfectly, but enough. Far above them, emergency evacuation systems roared back online throughout the station. Civilians would have time now. Time to breathe. Time to leave. The damaged platform beneath Ethan gave one final violent shudder. Metal supports snapped loose somewhere below. The walkway tilted sharply toward the spinning core. Lyra moved without thinking. She crossed half the collapsing platform before Ethan could even turn fully toward her. Her hand caught his arm just as the final support beam beneath them tore free. The world lurched sideways, then stopped. Emergency anchors had deployed automatically across the shaft. The platform hung suspended at a dangerous angle above the rotating core, while sparks rained through the darkness below like burning snow. Ethan looked at Lyra in stunned silence. Her silver hair drifted across her face beneath the unstable gravity field. "You came back," he said quietly. Lyra held tightly to his arm beneath the crushing pressure surrounding them both. "Humans are not the only species capable of carrying heavy things," she answered softly. Hours later, after the evacuation ships departed safely from Orpheus Station, medics found Ethan sitting silently in the recovery bay with an oxygen line beneath his nose and exhaustion buried deep in his face. Beside him on the small metal table rested an old ceramic coffee mug dented slightly along one side. Inside, somehow, one final sip still remained.